While never ever actually mandatory in Final Fantasy XIV, there is still some impressive skill and pride in rushing through a dungeon as fast as realistically possible. Now, one thing is perfecting a run so much that you get the actually fastest imaginable run, and another is employing some of the strategies that would normally be used for this to improve the pace you can run your dungeons at on a daily basis. In this video, I will go over a few tips and tricks, from actual practical things to do, to theoretical considerations you can use in more abstract ways to adjust your play around the things we can't always predict in a given group. And remember, if you have a tip of your own, or maybe you felt I forgot something important, be sure to leave it in the comments. Number 1. Maximize your pulls. Let's just start by getting the obvious one out of the way. Naturally, the most effective way to minimize the time you spend on the AoE pulls throughout the dungeon is to take them in as few pulls as possible. This is, however, a tip that should only be applicable by the tank, and by that logic, the only real way DPS and healer players really can play around how much the tank is pulling is by adjusting their cooldown usage around it. Not that you can do that much. The best you can do as a DPS or healer, if it is clear you could easily pull more, is recommend that the tank do so, as having a DPS or healer do the extra pulling can often make things get very awkward, both practically and socially. Number 2. Cooldowns on cooldown. It is easy to feel incentivized to save your big cooldowns for the big targets, the bosses. However, by doing so, you are essentially stalling your damage output on the big AoE pulls for little to no gain. If you've ever sat down to look into what to do when your cooldowns end up misaligned in a raid boss fight, the answer is almost always use it on cooldown anyway, because getting cooldowns spent somewhat effectively is more important. This is the same logic in a dungeon. It is better to have a big burst on an AoE pool and then have a burst again at some point during a boss fight, rather than skip the use on the AoE pool to be sure you have it in your opener on the boss. This is further emphasized by the fact that many jobs have to freestyle their openers in dungeon boss fights due to cooldowns not being ready, or having more or less resources than they'd normally expect to have. Add to this the fact that in many dungeons, the big AoE pulls are actually the much scarier part of the dungeon, as stalling too much can lead both the tank and healer to run out of steam, and that can lead to a wipe. This doesn't really happen in boss fights unless there is a complete misunderstanding of a boss mechanic. Being way too slow on damage in an AoE pool can wipe you out by that alone. An argument for saving cooldowns specifically for the bosses is that the fights being single target mostly means that your ability to push damage in those fights tend to be heavily throttled, so losing some damage and speed on the AoE pools to reduce the time a boss fight takes is beneficial. However, in nearly all situations, you are not gaining additional uses of cooldowns by saving them for the bosses, you just get to use them slightly sooner. In most cases, when you do go full blast on an AoE pool and use everything, the fights are over right around when your cooldowns end. Meanwhile, those same cooldowns only take up a set amount of a boss fight, so it is very likely that the time saved by saving cooldowns, if there is any at all, is the exact same time lost by saving the cooldowns earlier in the first place. But it is far more likely that more time is lost, considering, as I mentioned, that saving your cooldowns for the bosses typically just means that you get to use them earlier. It doesn't mean that you get additional uses of them in the boss fight. Use your cooldowns early and often, especially the damage ones. Number 3. Help the tank. Over aggro mobs, so now it's on you. Guide it into the tank's AoE. Got a healing tool you don't need yourself? Give it to the tank. Maybe you have a defensive cooldown that could help. The more assistance you give the tank, the easier the tank's job gets, and the more you can all focus on doing as much damage as possible. And by helping the tank stay alive, yes, even the warriors who do have a 17-second window after every bloodletting where they aren't entirely immortal, you can reduce the amount of focus the tank needs to have on their defensives, and interestingly, and more importantly, the less the healer needs to focus on their defensive play. If the white mage suddenly feels threatened and forced to cast Cure 2, but you had Rekindle all along and just didn't use it because you're selfish? then you actually using that rekindle on the tank could indirectly have led to the healer doing more damage, which means the group does more damage, which means you clear the dungeon slightly faster. I say could because sometimes the healer is going to cast Cure 2 anyway, and sometimes the tank needs both. Besides, the time saved isn't that much, but hey, if we want to go faster, every second counts, right? Further, by helping the tank collect the mobs, you also make sure the mobs get clumped up faster, meaning you can do full damage sooner, which is just more fun, right? Number 4. The pull is as long as the final mob. This is where things start to get more abstract, and this is certainly harder to use in practice. However, because that big wall doesn't disappear before the final mob dies, the AoE pull doesn't end before the final mob is dead. As long as there are enough mobs to warrant using AoE attacks, ultimately you can view the HP of every mob in the pack as equal to whatever has the most HP in the pack. This observation itself leads to a handful of ways you can improve your ability to clear a pull as fast as possible, almost regardless of what job you play. The first trick is that many AoE attacks are designed with a large amount of potency on your primary target with a significant damage drop-off on secondary targets. This means that if you observe that one or a few of the mobs in a large pool has significantly more HP, in general or just remaining, switching your primary target to them can cause their HP to catch up with the rest of the pack more easily, and also focuses the main bulk of the damage on the enemies that need to take the most damage possible. To take an example of this out of the newest dungeon, Mike Wazowski, you know, this guy appears to be tankier than the average mob in the packs. These opening packs in general seems to have a high variance in HP amounts, with these 4-legged long boys also having apparently more HP than the average mob in the packs. By prioritizing these mobs with more HP, you can end a pack sooner. The second trick is that specifically because a pull isn't ended until the final mob is dead. If a mob has way more HP than the rest of the pack, sometimes interspersing your AoE attacks with powerful single target options on the healthiest mobs, or even outright choosing to full-on switch to single target on the healthiest mob, can sometimes finish a pull faster. Naturally, this can cause problems if everyone switches at the same time. As long as some AoE damage is coming out, you're still benefiting from there being a lot of mobs, but cleaving down everything but one mob and then having to awkwardly single target this one guy for 10+ seconds doesn't feel great. The third trick, and this is the really weird one. Given the first two tricks, most of the damage you can do before all the mobs are pulled and clumped up can be viewed as very insignificant, at least in terms of clear speed. By cleaving half of the mobs down to 2/3 of their HP before the fight properly begins, it just means the entire mob pack will decrease a bit in size a little bit sooner. But if this comes at the cost of reducing the amount of burst you can do when the mobs finally are clumped up, is that really a good idea? Most jobs can use a decently satisfying filler sequence while running alongside the mobs, and often this can prepare them better to burst even harder when the mobs are clumped up. But there is one job in particular where this can get very awkward that really highlights the value of this abstract consideration. Should you, as a summoner, use Bahamut while the tank is still pulling? Or should you just kind of awkwardly sprint alongside the mobs and try and see if you can fit in a Tri-Disaster, maybe use Energy Siphon and just kinda be there to make sure that when the mobs are properly clumped up, you have the strongest possible burst to lead with? This is mainly a problem in the very first pull of a dungeon, since after that you at least have some agency to try and make it so you have some other primal spells to use while the pull is underway, so you don't just hang out. But the question still stands. Is it better to blast immediately or save the full burst for when the pack is ready? In my opinion, it depends on how well your team deals with prioritizing damage on the healthier mobs once everything is clumped up. And if the healthiest mob in the whole pool is in the first pack, then you could make use of this as an opportunity to take a big bite out of it specifically. In other words, it kind of depends, which is why this tip is abstract. You could even consider that using Bahamut right out the gate often surprises even some experienced tank players with the sheer amount of enmity it produces. And if the tank suddenly has to scramble to pick up all those mobs in case you can't handle it, then that will certainly slow down the pull. Number 5. View the dungeon as a single encounter. Building on multiple of the previous tips, just like how we view a trial boss or a raid boss as, well, a single fight encounter, because it is. If you view a dungeon as a single encounter with downtime periods, then it can become a lot easier to optimize the whole thing. For example, it is pretty common for an AoE pull to take around 1 minute from the start of the pull to the last mob being dead. Less time in very optimal groups, more in below average groups. As such, if you use all of your damage cooldowns for an AoE pull, you will usually have the 1 minute cooldowns back for the next pull and the 2 minute cooldowns back early in the boss fight after using them on the first pack in the dungeon, or the first pack after a boss. Similarly, making the most of sprint between packs minimizes the amount of time you spend in this encounter running. This is typically done by using sprint just before entering combat or when the tank does, so you all run for 20 seconds instead of just 10. This can get even more optimal by using sprint earlier in advance to make sure sprint is ready again before the next pull. And the more cooldowns you have ticking on to get ready again while running between packs, the more free damage you can feasibly get this way. If you use a 1 minute cooldown, it ends after 20 seconds, and then the fight ends promptly after. If you don't have a good opportunity to use the cooldown again until 40 seconds later, then it is almost as if the ability had no cooldown, right? Using the summoner example again, if using Bahamut while the tank is still pulling doesn't lead to you having a rather mediocre burst once the mobs are finally clumped up. In fact, as long as this doesn't outright negatively impact your next pull, then it is possible that using Bahamut, or Phoenix, during the pulling part is optimal. But to know for sure, you often have to look further ahead than just the pull you're currently in the middle of. This kind of perspective can surprisingly often lead to some weirdly unintuitive tricks to optimize in a dungeon, especially when really trying to master a specific job in all aspects of the game. With that said, I would love to hear tips and tricks that you have learned yourself for running dungeons faster, so be sure to leave them in the comments if you have any to share. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, before Shadowbringers, many AoE attacks had extremely complicated and long-winded ways to describe their damage, as it had gradually dropping AoE damage. This meant, for example, that Flare in Stormblood did full damage to the primary target, then 15% less to the second, 30% less to the third, 45% less to the fourth, 60% less to the fifth, and 70% less to the rest, which made it very confusing to calculate exactly how good it was given a certain number of enemies.